Good evening and welcome. Near the time of our country's creation, Thomas Jefferson said that an informed citizenry is at the heart of a dynamic democracy. In more contemporary times, Daniel Patrick Moynihan stated that everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts, a sentiment that has been frequently and favorably repeated. Today's America, though, is plagued by the growing inability of its citizens to come to agreement about even important facts. A clear contributor to this problem is the array of powerful tools of disinformation, which frequently are employed for political advantage, sometimes creating an alternative reality or alternate facts. Another is the clear and conscious abandonment by some, including some leaders, of the shared priority that had long been assigned to truth in our society. Take the 2020 presidential election. A loud, visible, and not insubstantial portion of the citizenry, led to its beliefs by the claims of our former president, has attacked the election as the big steal. Most often, those attacks have been verbal, but on January 6th in our nation's capital, they took a different form, doing violence to people and property and our longstanding national commitment to the rule of law. A competing portion of the citizenry has dismissed the big steal as the big lie. That position has been consistently supported by election officials of both parties across multiple states, and also has been upheld by essentially unbroken string of state and federal court decisions in the large number of cases rebuffing challenges to the election results lodged by the former president and his allies. Pennsylvania, the swing state with the most electoral votes, has occupied a central position in this drama. Election results here were challenged in court not only by the Trump campaign, but by others, including the state of Texas and some members of the Pennsylvania congressional delegation who had been reelected by the very ballots they sought to invalidate. Challenges to the Pennsylvania elections also featured prominently in the congressional proceedings on January 6th. Tonight, then, we will focus on Pennsylvania, not only as our home state, but because what happened here provides a clear indication of what occurred or might have occurred in other places as well. We will begin by looking at the recent past and then turn our attention to the future. My name is Mark Nordenberg. I'm the former chancellor of the University of Pittsburgh and currently serve as chair of Pitt's Institute of Politics and its Dick Thornburgh Forum for Law and Public Policy. It is my privilege to welcome you on behalf of the Institute and the Thornburgh Forum. Let me also take this early opportunity to thank our co-sponsors, the Committee of 70, the League of Women Voters, and the University of Pittsburgh Cyber Institute, Honors College, and School of Law. In response to the pandemic, which made in-person large audience programs impossible, the Institute of Politics and Dick Thornburgh Forum released 14 pre-recorded interviews under the title Governing in Crisis in the last 8 months of 2020. This evening, we're turning the page in two respects by moving to a live streaming format for at least our next several programs, and by presenting the next series of programs under the banner Preserving Democracy. One advantage of this new format is that registrants were given the opportunity to submit questions, and you responded with both quality and quantity. Your questions have helped to shape this evening's interview. Some of them will be posed to our distinguished guest later in our exchange, and others will have an impact on future programming. Thank you. We're very fortunate that David Thornburgh has agreed to be featured in this dialogue. David has built an enviable career in public policy, including service as executive director of the Fels Institute of Government at Penn. He currently serves as the president and CEO of the Committee of 70, a nonpartisan organization that has been an advocate for good government for more than a century. Central to its mission is strengthening democracy and protecting and improving the voting process in Pennsylvania. Many consider David to be this state's leading authority on both elections and redistricting, and I certainly am one of them. David also is a proud son of Dick Thornburgh, the Pitt Law graduate and trustee, who served 2 terms as the highly respected Republican governor of Pennsylvania, as the United States Attorney General under both President Ronald Reagan and President George Herbert Walker Bush, and as Undersecretary of the United Nations. The very recent passing of Governor Thornburgh has been mourned by his family, his friends, and his countless admirers. The governor believed that serving on behalf of others is the highest calling, and both high achievement and integrity marked his service to others in each and every position that he held. His commitment to truth, facts, and the rule of law is evidenced by the title of his autobiography, Where the Evidence Leads. David, on behalf of the entire Dick Thornburgh Forum and IOP communities, let me extend sincere sympathies to you, to your mother, Ginny Thornburgh, who I know is in the audience this evening, and to your entire family. We obviously are very proud to have the opportunity to sustain your father's legacy. And what better way to do that than by interviewing one of his sons on a topic with respect to which he had great interest.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mark. And I know I speak for our entire family when we recognize and applaud not just your participation tonight, but your leadership of the Dick Thornburgh Forum, and look forward to many years of working together to forward the spirit that my dad embraced and that you and the forum continue.
Well, as I've said before, many people today say, where are the Dick Thornburghs of 2021 when we need them? And hopefully by highlighting his example will help some of them emerge. But to begin our discussion of the election of 2020, we really need to go back to the Election Reform Act, known as Act 77, which became law on October 31st of 2019. In retrospect, that law seems to have been perfectly designed for a state that was about to endure a pandemic. But we know that on October 31st, 2019, nobody knew the pandemic was coming. So what is it that brought the executive and legislative branches together to make election reform a priority at that point? And what were the principal products of that effort?
Sure. Well, you point out a lesson of history that we hope is not forgotten, because I always feel like people want to assume that Act 77 was passed in response to the pandemic, and in fact, it had very different origins. I'll trace the stream back to something that both you and I were involved in, actually, a Blue Ribbon Commission on security issues in elections that Dave Hickton, when he was at the university, co-chaired. And that effort pointed out that the Commonwealth was operating with voting machines in too many instances that were less than secure. I think, as I recall, something like 2/3 of the voters in Pennsylvania were voting on machines that really didn't have a paper backup, and that therefore you really didn't have an ability to kind of check the results of the machine against an independent body of data. So that was in the works, and I think Governor Wolf was very concerned about that. A lot of folks in the counties were very concerned about that. So that came together to suggest that it was time to buy new voting machines in a lot of Pennsylvania's counties. And there was a steep price tag. It was about $90 million, I think. And then the question was, well, how the heck are we going to pay for that? And the counties said, well, look, we have a pretty limited tax base and not a lot of options here. So can we get some help from the state? Governor Wolf, along the way, basically decertified the existing voting machines that were not as secure as they could have been. So that forced things along as well. So that was one major plank in the platform of Act 77. And I think that's what really drove the discussion. But as happens in a legislative context, everybody gets a chance to throw another plank on the platform. So pretty soon, in a classic bipartisan fashion, you had other things. You had the end of so-called straight ticket voting. So you could no longer pull the big lever, as it were, and just vote for every candidate of a particular party. It also, I think, in the interest of the governor, it expanded the use of mail voting, so-called no excuse absentee balloting, which we had absentee balloting, but you had to have an excuse, a very defined, one of several defined excuses. The act also changed deadlines running up to the election to give people more time to register, and in particular to register by mail. So, as I said, there was a negotiated series of the planks in the platform that came together in Act 77. As you pointed out, ultimately passed in October of 2019, before no one had ever knew what a COVID was, or that a very short time later we were going to be in the grip of this pandemic. So we sailed into the spring, the fall election of November 2019 under those rules, I think it was a reasonable package of give and take, and it was a major step forward in terms of the way we vote in Pennsylvania. Our election code, most of it was written in 1937. And has only been updated sort of sporadically and somewhat erratically. So this was a big deal, but it was still the warm-up act for, as you suggested, something quite momentous that we encountered in the spring and fall of 2020.
Well, you use the word bipartisan. A word that seems to get watered down sometimes in these polarized times. That is, if you get one vote from the other party, it's bipartisan. How bipartisan was this effort and the final vote?
I honestly don't have the vote in my head, but it was a real bipartisan agreement. It wasn't just a token bipartisan, because frankly, we have a Republican legislature and a Democratic governor, and I think the Republicans got some things that they thought were going to be significant. Namely, one of them being the end of straight ticket voting, which there's not much research to suggest this, but the belief was that straight ticket voting voted Democrats, particularly in urban areas. So they felt that was a that was a big win. So, but it was a legitimate bipartisan agreement.
You know, and it'll surprise you when I say that I do have the numbers right in front of me.
Okay.
Because it was the Republicans who turned away from no excuse mail-in voting, it did seem to me telling that Republican senators voted 35-0 for Act 77, and Republicans in the House of Representatives voted 105-2 in favor of that act, which included no excuse mail-in voting. So when was it that Republicans began to fall away from mail-in votes?
Well, look, it really wasn't. Let me back up a second. Historically, what we know about mail-in voting is that actually more Republicans had voted by mail typically than Democrats, but it was fairly even, and there seemed to be no discernible partisan bias to mail voting. And there are states like Utah, which is a very Republican state that do almost all their voting by mail. Colorado is now kind of a purple state, but they're almost all primarily vote by mail state. So there wasn't any particular sense that in going into this that it was going to swing one way or the other. I will say, though, that I think in 2016, about 4% of people voted by mail. And that was sort of the anticipation. Well, maybe it wouldn't be 4%, maybe it'd go up to 8%. But still, the smart money said most people were still going to vote in person. Fast forward, of course, to the pandemic, and about 40% of people statewide voted by mail. So about 10 times the percentage of folks that had voted in by mail in 2016. So as that story developed, and we could see that in the primary election of 2020, all of a sudden this was going to be of much greater consequence to the outcome than anyone had anticipated. Along the way, and really going back to 2016, President Trump, even candidate Trump in 2016, had loudly and frequently, you used the term big lie, suggested that our elections were rigged, fraudulent. You'll remember he said that about the 2016 popular vote, that the 3 million margin that of the popular vote that Hillary had was made up. Of course, that was not true. And then I think as the pandemic nationally, as the pandemic became real and more states turned to mail balloting as a way to give people a secure way of voting, the president ramped up his rhetoric on mail voting, despite the fact, as folks have pointed out, that he voted absentee himself repeatedly and even in this election. And there is no difference mechanically or logistically between absentee voting and voting, no excuse absentee voting. It's all sort of comes out in the wash. So that to me is what happened. The rhetoric started heating up, and then it became clear that not 4%, but what turned out to be 40% of people were going to be voting by mail. So it became of consequence, and whipped up by the president's repeated assertions of falsehood, it became a huge partisan issue. Unfortunately, just terribly unfortunately.
And meanwhile, as the number of people using mail-in ballots increased dramatically, there were pressures on election officials to adapt to these demands. How were adjustments made, or how were implementation decisions made as we really moved forward with a new form of balloting?
Yeah, well, you'll recall that the big decision in the primary of 2020 was to move the primary election to give local election officials more time to adapt to the changing circumstances. So that was a big move. But it's really important to try to frame the situation that our county officials found themselves in. All of a sudden, they were being asked at a time of pandemic and then civil unrest around the primary elections. They were being asked to run two parallel elections, one in person and one by mail. And no one could really predict with accuracy how many people were going to vote by mail or vote in person. So you had to kind of build in an excess of capacity on both accounts. And mail voting in particular is a more involved process. When you're dealing with volume, you basically turn your shop into a mail house. And you've got to figure out ways to sort mail, to open mail, all in a high security, high consequence environment. And then also remember that in Pennsylvania, and a lot of folks really didn't appreciate this on the way in, county governments run elections, not the state, not the federal government, but county governments. And there's 67 of them. Forest County with a few thousand people, Allegheny County with about 1.2 million, Philadelphia County with 1.5 million. So you also had highly varied degrees of capacity, of resources. Each one had its own particular culture of running elections. And so this was the ubiquitous perfect storm, even by the primary of 2020, was starting to form. We could see the contours of what was coming down the road and what was going to hit us. And the county officials, bless their souls, the county election directors were going to be right smack dab in the middle of things.
And they stayed right smack dab in the middle, didn't they? Because really at this point, the bipartisanship seemed to have gone. So the executive and legislative branches weren't able to swing into action and provide either additional support or additional guidance.
Yeah. Well, and we knew as of February what we were running into, particularly around this issue. It's got a more arcane name than it should, the issue of what's called pre-canvassing, which is simply pre-canvassing refers to the processing of the mail ballots that you receive. And the problem was Act 77 had locked in the processing of mail balloting that it said it couldn't begin until 7 a.m. of election day. So fast forward to the general election in Philadelphia, you had 450,000 mail ballots piling up that you couldn't basically touch until 7 a.m. of election day. But again, we knew that in February. And we also knew that if that was going to be the case, there was no way on God's earth that we could count those, what ended up being, I think, 2.6 million mail ballots in Pennsylvania. We could not count them and register those tallies by the end of election night. So we knew back in February of 2020 that we were going to have a lag in the counting of those ballots, that it could be, I remember telling reporters back then, even then, it's going to be election week. It's going to take us a few days. The in-person ballots are going to come in first and then the mail ballots. So it's kind of, to watch this all play out, it's like a slow-moving car wreck. We knew this was going to happen. And frankly, the legislature just couldn't get itself together to come to the aid of our county election officials and help them out. And I think that's a great shame because it set up the conditions. It opened the door to this narrative that we had to go through that was terribly damaging to the Commonwealth and our voters and ultimately the country. But I may be getting a little ahead of the story.
But when you say it was a slow-moving train wreck, it wasn't a wreck in terms of the work that was done and the ballots that were tallied and the results that were ultimately reported, was it?
Absolutely. And I guilty of perhaps a poor choice of metaphor, because our county election officials performed valiantly under extraordinarily demanding conditions, overworked, understaffed, and they deserve all the credit in the world. You know, if I had to give a letter grade to the whole election experience here in Pennsylvania, I give it a solid B plus, an A for effort, solid B plus. B plus only because the circumstances, the context, the logistics that folks had to deal with was just unlike probably any election in the Commonwealth's history. But it wasn't a B plus for lack of trying and just sheer hard work.
And an important part, I guess, of assessing how things did go is that once the election was over, the claims of fraud continued. In fact, they intensified, but they also had to be channeled into formal settings for assessment and decision making. And these lawsuits were filed all over the country. To the best of your knowledge, were claims of fraud upheld either in Pennsylvania or in any other state?
No, absolutely not. I think the record of the lawsuits around the country was maybe one partial win and about 60 losses. And I remind folks, we have a process in place to contest elections, and it runs through the courts, state courts and federal courts, and there's a lot of moving around to figure out which is best for the various aggrieved parties. But the good news about what happens once you get into court is you have to present evidence that has to be based on an interpretation of the law. And you have to deal with, I love your quote of the famous Moynihan quote, you have to deal with facts, not hypotheses, not guesses, not hunches, not theories, not whispered down the wire, somebody said to somebody, but actual facts, observable facts, true facts. And I think that you know, because we have that in place and these challenges emerged in the run up to the election and after the election, and they had such a were rejected so consistently, ought to give us comfort that this was an election process that was well managed and that didn't suffer from fraud, didn't have breakdowns, either logistic breakdowns or breakdowns caused by some partisan plot. And I know not everyone's convinced by facts and the role of the courts, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but that's the bedrock here. That's what we have to stand on, and that's the most firm foundation for this whole experience. And where the evidence leads, that's where the evidence led us.
Well, I've been formally out of the law for a long time now, so actually reading some judicial opinions was like a trip down memory lane for me. And I can only say that some of the opinions I read were brutally decisive in announcing the decisions that were being rendered. And I thought, in fact, maybe I would read some language from an opinion of Federal District Court Judge Matthew Brand, who'd been a Republican Party official for years, a member of the Federalist Society, a member of the NRA. But this is what he said in dismissing an action brought by the Trump campaign in the Middle District of Pennsylvania. Plaintiff asks this court to disenfranchise almost 7 million voters. One might expect that when seeking such a startling outcome, a plaintiff would come formidably armed with compelling legal arguments and factual proof of rampant corruption. That has not happened. Instead, this court has been presented with strained legal arguments without merit and speculative accusations unpled in the operative complaint and unsupported by evidence. In the United States of America, this cannot justify the disenfranchisement of a single voter, let alone all the voters of its sixth most populous state. Our people, laws, and institutions demand more. And the decision of that judge was upheld by a 3-judge panel of the circuit court, all of whom had been appointed by Republican presidents. The opinion writer had been appointed by President Trump, and at his confirmation hearing, every Republican had voted for him. Every Democrat except Senator Manchin had voted against him. And so again, this notion of corruption or a system that was somehow tilted unfairly just doesn't hold up when you look at what happened.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a well-expressed opinion. Let me just also, you mentioned this earlier on, but this occurred to me in October as these claims were mounting and the president was whipping up his crowd. This election was a good election for the Republican Party in Pennsylvania, with really only 2 exceptions. Josh Shapiro was reelected as Attorney General, and Donald Trump lost the presidency. But the Republicans won the state treasurer's race. They won the Auditor General's race. They picked up 4 seats in the House. They held their margin in the Senate. And everyone was on the same ballot. Everyone was on the same ballot. So there's a basic bit of a breakdown in logic to suggest that somehow the presidential results were skewed one way, but every other race that was on those same ballots went the other way. And the only conclusion you can come to is there are a lot of folks that were quite willing to vote for the Republican candidates, except Donald Trump. So I think we have to keep that in mind, and maybe we'll talk earlier about some of these same candidates for election, Congress, legislature, and so forth, who were on that same ballot, who somehow expressed a lack of faith in the integrity of those ballots, despite the fact that in most cases they were reelected. It, as they say, just doesn't add up.
And in fact, as I mentioned before, and as you know, some Republicans who won re-election through those same ballots actually did sue to overturn the Pennsylvania election on the grounds that Act 77 was unconstitutional. What do you have to say about that effort?
Well, I said this to you when we were talking about this conversation. There was plenty of time to object to the constitutionality of Act 77 before the general election of 2020. You could have raised those issues when the legislative package was coming together in the fall of 2019. You could have raised it even after the bill was passed and signed into law. You noted the margins. What was it? A unanimous vote in the Senate, and only 2 opposed it in the House. So there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of consternation about the constitutionality of that bill. And I think you then have to be a little, the motives have to be a little suspect when those constitutional questions only seem to come to the fore after the game's over and the score is known.
Well, and in fact, that was the theme of one of the opinions that was written by a justice of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, which turned away this case on the equitable doctrine of laches, which is basically what you just described. You can't wait and wait and wait and disadvantage others through your waiting. And Justice Wecht said this: having delayed this suit until 2 elections were conducted under Act 77's new no-excuse mail-in voting system, petitioners play a dangerous game at the expense of every Pennsylvania voter. Petitioners waived their opportunity to challenge Act 77 before the election, choosing instead to lay by and gamble upon receiving a favorable decision of the electorate. Unsatisfied with the results of that wager, they would now flip over the table, scattering to the shadows the votes of millions of Pennsylvanians. It's not our role to lend legitimacy to such transparent and untimely efforts to subvert the will of Pennsylvania voters. Courts should not decide elections when the will of the voters is clear.
Yeah.
And because the court did not get into issues of constitutional language interpretation, that decision also has been described as a deflection. But to me, it was a decision that really got to the heart of the matter.
Yeah.
Are you really going to throw out millions of votes?
Yeah.
Now that the election has come this far and the people have spoken.
Well, you know, this reminds me, a friend of mine who's a litigator said there are 3 basic strategies you can take when you're litigating a case. And I say this with enormous respect for the legal profession. He said, if the facts work for you, argue the facts. If the facts don't work for you, but the process does, argue the process. If neither the facts nor the process work for you, bang the table and yell. And there was a lot more banging the table and yelling in the litigation around this election than there was a respect for the facts or a consideration of the process. So, but the system held. We reviewed the bidding, and I hope we can take again comfort and solace that the verdict is in. Literally, the verdict is in on the integrity of the election process in Pennsylvania.
So a key question, David, then is where do we go from here?
Yeah.
And it was interesting as I looked at the questions that had been submitted by registrants tonight. There were some who wanted to know whether we could really kick it into high gear and do things like register everybody automatically at the age of 18 and make more use of ballot boxes. There were people who thought that it would be most important if we were able to do some of the administrative improving, like processing the ballots earlier.
Yep.
There were some people who were wary of the process that now exists, either because they had security concerns of their own or because they thought that with mail-in voting, we would not now ever have an electorate that accepted the results.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a lot of work to be done. And, you know, just in this last week, my staff and I met with the chairs of both, the majority chairs of both the House and Senate state government committees, Senator Argyle and Representative Grove. And our message to them, and I think they embrace this, is first of all, let's just calm down. Let's calm down. We've got to diffuse the partisan rancor and remind ourselves that the voting process, there's nothing that should be partisan about the voting process. It should be a boring process. We should be able to take it for granted and count on the thousands of men and women around the Commonwealth who actually make it work and don't get themselves involved in all the partisan football. There is work to be done. And I think the pressure test of this 2020 election reveals leaks. And I would call these, words are important. These are inconsistencies, not irregularities. Irregularities makes it sound like there was some nefarious intent. They're inconsistencies, partly because you have Forest County and you have Philadelphia County. You can't ask both counties to, acquire the same equipment and the manpower and the resources and so forth and so on. We've got to address the pre-canvassing issue. If we want to avoid that nightmare scenario that was falsely painted by the president on November 3rd and following, we've got to allow county boards of elections to process the ballots earlier. Not open them, not count them. Not count them, but literally prepare them for processing. We've got to go back and take a look at some of the emergency measures that were put in place. How do we feel about using drop boxes for people to drop off their mail ballots? How about the satellite election offices that were put into place? What other dates do we need to move around? The states, the backbone of the IT system of the state's election apparatus, the SURE system, is an 18-year-old computer system. It's almost to the point where we're trading floppy disks, which we were 18 years ago. So there are a lot of things to be considered. Representative Grove has, I think, is on number 3 of a series of 14 hearings through the House State Government Committee to consider a lot of those changes. There also is, and we put a lot of emphasis in this, a piece of legislation in the spring of 2020 created something called the Election Law Advisory Board, which has members appointed from each congressional district, as well as by the caucus leaders. Those folks were also approved by the state Senate. So they've got some legitimacy and have been vetted, and they're good people. And they met for the first time just this past week. I think we should be turning to folks like that to help us make our way through the challenges and changes that we ought to execute. I think these hearings can be helpful. They were a little protracted. I'm not quite sure why we need 14 of them, but so be it. It'll give everybody a chance to have their say. So there are some short-term things that we should do. I will say this, though. I mentioned earlier, our state election code dates the bulk of it from 1937, when I remind people that mail was delivered to your home twice a day back then. So these are, some things have changed since then. And it's sorely in need of a stem to stern rewrite. I happened to be looking at the code today because I guess that's what I do. And there's a section in there that requires local precincts to provide a voter with a lantern to make sure that the ballot is lit up inside the voting booth so that they can see it. Literally a lantern. So among other things, we might go back into the code and suggest that no one uses lanterns anymore. So I think getting, again, out of the heat of battle, getting a respected bipartisan group together, maybe another blue ribbon commission that says, what does a modern election code look like in Pennsylvania? What do we learn from other states? That feels like it's long overdue.
Well, and it would be good if we could get people from both parties working on that and then come forward with a product for the general population. Going back to some of the first issues that I mentioned, do you have any thoughts for people who are with us tonight about dealing with disinformation?
Yeah, it's a serious threat because it destabilizes our basic sense of how things work and who's accountable and who's responsible and where do things come from. You can't get too far in the conversation about disinformation without talking about social media, which is basically, once the internet became ubiquitous in the mid 90s, all of a sudden anybody can produce content that to the eye of the reader looks like it came from a legitimate source, and it spins faster and faster. So here's the buckets that I look at. I think this is one of those things that deserves some government interaction, but also asks more from citizens as well. I think probably this has to be done at the national level. We've got to look at the platforms and apply some of the same standards that we use for the traditional legacy media, broadcast media and print media and so forth. Because while they're somewhat different in form and they make money in different ways, they have the same impact on our civic discourse. In terms of the role of citizens, I remind folks, nobody is requiring you to spend your life on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or Snapchat or TikTok or pick your favorite platform. So you should always ask yourself, will my life improve if I push away from the social media table? And I would suggest, yeah, actually it would, because there's a lot of other things to do with your life. Talk to real people, walk your dog, go to your kid's baseball game, all those things that don't involve a screen and clumsy thumb typing. And even if you limit your diet, even if you choose your news wisely on social media, always ask yourself, where is this news coming from? Where is this coming from? Do I trust this source? Don't just blindly forward a piece of, warmed over news from some unknown source. Force yourself to ask that question. The final thing I'd say is we've got to support local journalism. Facebook and the news that you get on Facebook or Twitter is not a good substitute from real on-the-ground reporting from folks who know the context and the sources and the process. And I know local journalism has been hit enormously hard by social media, but that's something we need to embrace. It's part of our civic our civic being, our civic essence. And so none of these things are easy to do, but that doesn't and shouldn't prevent us from having a go at it, as the Brits say.
What about dealing with each other? Because there often are very personal barriers these days that surface too.
Yep. Well, that's of enormous concern too, because if we get to the point where we demonize and villainize each other and literally can't talk to each other when there are forbidden topics, we're in trouble. This sounds a little corny, sounds like, your third grade teacher speaking, but I said to somebody recently, quoting that line, that God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth on purpose, that we should be listening. That you should, if you have somebody that you disagree with, you should start with a question and listen carefully to their responses and look for ways to bring them sideways to some shared sense of fact and some common sense of where an issue sits and where things stand. Again, this maybe sounds like the inner Pollyanna in me, but I don't know what alternative we have to taking that kind of approach and trying it, because we have learned that endless flame wars on Twitter get us absolutely nowhere and make us sick to our stomach, and ultimately bear responsibility for what happened on January 6th. So push away from the table and try a different approach.
When, of course, January 6th was awful. But I gather there were, if not acts of violence, at least threats of violence here that also had a big impact on the lives of our election professionals.
Yeah. I mean, I got to know City Commissioner Al Schmidt here in Philadelphia, who was a Republican elected city commissioner. He's a feature of an article in the New York Times Magazine right after the election. And I had coffee with him maybe 2 or 3 weeks after the election, and he was still getting death threats. He still had 24-hour police protection on him and his parents and his family, all because he stood up and said, you know, we go where the evidence leads. And by the way, he was working 24/7. His staff was. He threw himself into that effort and got nothing but death threats, and that's unconscionable. That's just not. That's a third world republic. That's not this great republic that we have inherited. And I said this to you a couple of days ago. As a consequence of that environment, fully 1/3 of all the election directors in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania have quit within the last year. So we've lost the institutional memory and their competence. These wonderful men and women who do this thankless task that nobody ever cares about until this year, and that's just a shame. So we've got a lot of rebuilding to do, and again, finding ways to sort of deaccelerate and to bring this conversation back to a place where we can talk reasonably about how to make it work better.
I do want to spend at least 5 minutes talking about one of your areas of specialty, and that is redistricting. And I'll maybe fire 3 questions at you, and you can combine them in whatever way you'd like.
Okay.
What can we expect in the upcoming redistricting processes? What impact will the possible loss of a congressional seat have? And I guess of real immediate interest is the proposal to elect Supreme Court justices by district.
Sure. Well, let me just say at the outset, I think one of a promising development, if we could get there, is that we agree as a Commonwealth in a political process that there are some really important processes that are off limits to partisan interference. Voting should be one of them. The voting process should be one of them. Selecting judges should be one of them. You mentioned the proposal that's out there now. And I think drawing the boundaries of legislative and congressional districts should be one of them. Because the temptations for overreach or for partisan manipulation are just too great. Our history has proved that. Now, when it comes to redistricting, despite our efforts, and as you know, I was chaired the Pennsylvania Redistricting Commission that Governor Wolf, the bipartisan group that Governor Wolf assembled, we've not been able to reform the process, to change the process. We're left with the process that we've had for a long time, for decades. Having said that, though, I do think this is going to be quite a different go-round for redistricting in this year and into early next year. First of all, we do have a political check and balance. We have a Democratic governor, even though we have a Republican General Assembly. We have an awareness of the issue and a hands-on engagement in that issue by everyday citizens that we've never had before in the history of the Commonwealth. As you know, because I came to Pitt about a year ago to come speak about this, the Committee of 70, with the support of some great foundations, including Pittsburgh Foundations, started a project called Draw the Lines PA, which is based on the simple predicate that if we give actual everyday citizens the opportunity to draw their own maps and to use that to engage them in this issue of redistricting, they will in fact be a powerful counterbalance to what has happened in the past, the excesses that have happened in the past. And we now have about 10,000 people across the Commonwealth who have hands-on experience in drawing their own congressional and legislative maps. So they know how to do it and what the deal is. And we'll be bringing them into this conversation. We don't have to be invited to. We can just bring them into the conversation between now and when the maps are drawn. To your last point, anytime we lose a congressional seat, which we have with regularity over the last 9 decades, it's a free-for-all. It is the game of musical chairs, and one more chair has been taken away. And there are no rules about how you reallocate the remaining districts. So the fur will fly.
It's nice that you can say that with a smile on your face. And I do assume, too, that in addition to some of the other proposals that are moving forward, there always is a push within this Commonwealth to begin moving away from elected judges, isn't there?
Well, there has been. This was actually, maybe, I know I'm watching our clock, this may be a good note to end on. This was an idea that my dad was passionate about when he was elected to the Constitutional Convention back in the 1960s. And he couldn't quite push it over the goal line. But I think as a lawyer, and most lawyers, people who work in the profession, and every living governor and tons of other folks have realized that that electing judges, appellate judges in the Commonwealth is just not a good idea. This proposal that you mentioned makes it a bad idea even worse by electing judges from districts around the Commonwealth. So all of a sudden they become essentially like local elected representatives rather than interpreters of the Constitution. But I think the flame that my dad lit around that issue back in the 60s is still strong, and I'm hopeful that it'll be sufficient to carry the day.
Well, David, that is a good note to end on. I want to thank you for all that you have contributed this evening. I do want to thank everyone in the audience for being with us and for submitting such great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but we will be doing a series of these programs over the course of the next few months. We'll let you know what's coming up. And I also do want to mention that the lectures and interviews that we have done on the past are available on the IOP or Dick Thornburgh Forum websites. And some of them actually take a more in-depth look at issues that we have touched upon tonight. For example, David was here about this time last year, and we spent an entire hour on redistricting and gerrymandering and the issues that come up. Dave Hickton also was in at that same time, our former US attorney, founding director of our Cyber Institute, and now off in Washington, leading oversight efforts on coronavirus. But he gave a great talk on Can Democracy Survive the Internet? We did an interview with former US Postmaster General Patrick Donahoe about the ability of the US Postal Service to deal with increased demands in elections like the one we were about to have. David Shribman, the Pulitzer Prize winning executive editor emeritus of the Post-Gazette, did an interview about the truth and does it still matter? So if you're interested in some of these topics that we didn't quite do justice tonight, there are other places to look. This interview also will be posted sometime next week. And when it's posted, it will include materials for those who want to learn more or do more, or that will be of help to people who might want to use the video of the interview or portions of it in classes that they're teaching. Great to be with you, David. A lot of important topics, and we are grateful to you.
Thank you so much, Mark. This is a really, really important conversation, and I love the topic and the brand of preserving democracy. I think my dad would smile to know that that's what we're about. So thank you. Glad to be with you, and I look forward to many, many conversations on all the above.
Thank you very much, and thanks again, and good night, everyone.